All right, our next speaker is the director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. He is going to talk to you about the intersection of cannabis and opioid use. Please welcome Dr. Jeff Chen.
Cool. All right, everybody, thanks for having me. I know lunch is coming up soon, and I'll try to keep this entertaining. I know cannabis is a very boring subject matter, so I'll try to keep you guys engaged. Today we're going to be going through a series of potential intersections. I'll describe the state of the evidence, and unfortunately, a lot of it's mixed at the end of the day. So what's the current state of evidence of the use of cannabis for chronic pain? What's the current state of evidence of the opioid-sparing properties of cannabis or cannabinoids? That is, the ability to co-administer cannabis or cannabinoids and reduce the amount of opioids that are consumed. What's the impact on cannabis state laws and prevalence of usage on overdoses from opioids? How might cannabis or cannabinoids address withdrawal symptoms from opioids? And lastly, how might cannabis or cannabinoids address some of the cravings for opioids? Okay, so on the first topic of chronic pain, this is probably where we have the most evidence for the therapeutic potential of cannabis. And actually, there were two recent meta-analyses looking at all of the randomized controlled trials on this subject matter. And the Annals of Internal Medicine review found that there was low-strength evidence of the effectiveness of cannabis for neuropathic pain, and it was insufficient for all the other pain categories. Now, contrast that with the National Academy of Sciences review, which was published right around the same time, which actually found substantial evidence that cannabis was effective for chronic pain. Okay? Now, both meta-analyses agree that out of all of the chronic pain evidence, really the most evidence is for neuropathic pain, nerve pain. Which is also really interesting because that's one of the areas where, in terms of the use of opioids for nerve pain, that's an area where there isn't actually a lot of evidence for the efficacy of opioids for nerve pain. And so the idea that you have an alternative that might be effective is very promising. Also note that there's studies looking at two types mainly of cannabis products. On one hand, it's a 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD administered as a spray in the mouth. Okay, so that's used in a lot of these randomized controlled trials for pain. And another chunk is where they actually vaporize whole plant cannabis. And there's also been shown efficacy for that in controlled clinical trials. One important thing to note is that in terms of the vaporization of cannabis, they were using cannabis at a very low potency of THC, anywhere from typically 3 to 8% THC by weight, whereas anything you buy in a dispensary nowadays, 15, 20 plus percentage. But in these clinical trials using low dose THC cannabis, you were able to get pain relief. And you were able to get pain relief at doses where the subjects didn't really report much psychoactivity or cognitive impairment. And in fact, at the higher dose, in some of these studies, at higher dose THC levels, the pain actually got worse. You got hyperalgesia. So there's this biphasic effect that we're starting to tease apart for cannabis. So the conclusion is, it looks like there's evidence of the use of cannabinoids for chronic pain. Nerve pain is the most promising, and more is not necessarily better. You can achieve pain relief at doses where you don't have psychoactivity, and that's important. All right, let's talk about the synergy with opioids, or this opioid-sparing properties of cannabis. So there was a recent meta-analysis conducted looking at preclinical studies. And they looked at 19 preclinical studies where they administered various opioids with THC. And what they found out of 17 out of the 19 studies, there was demonstrated effect of synergy. So very good evidence from the preclinical literature, so in animal studies. But what's interesting is it depends on type of opioids. So with codeine, you have almost you need 10 times less codeine for the same amount of pain relief when you administer THC along with it, 10 times less. But for something like morphine, it's only 3 times less. You can use 3 times less morphine to achieve the same level of pain relief when you add THC. Okay? Now, what does this look like? Again, so it's opioid specific. So this gets a little more complicated now. And what does this look like in humans? Well, I'm actually going to present data from Ziva Cooper, who published the first study in humans looking at the synergy between cannabis and opioids. And she's actually leaving Columbia and joining us at UCLA, joining our cannabis initiative at UCLA. So we're really excited to have her. So in her study that was published earlier this year, she had 4 different treatment arms. So she basically had participants get no cannabis, no oxycodone. She had participants get cannabis, again, low-dose cannabis, 5.6% THC, and no oxycodone. They got placebo. Or they got placebo cannabis with oxycodone, or they got both. Okay, so we're evaluating all of these different combinations to see what happens. And another thing to keep in mind, this was artificial pain in a lab. So they took healthy participants and induced pain with them. So there's various things you can do to induce pain. You can apply pressure, you can do rapid temperature changes of their extremities to mimic pain. So what they found is when they got placebo, they had no increase in pain tolerance, pain threshold. When you gave them cannabis, they had about a 20% bump in the amount of pain tolerance. So a 20% increase in analgesic effect, you could say. When they received 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone, so very low dose oxycodone, they had about a 5 to 10% increase in pain tolerance. So again, not as much as cannabis, but they still got better than placebo. Now, when they combined the two, you had about a 50% jump in the amount of increase in pain tolerance that you got. So again, the first demonstration of synergy in humans, published earlier this year. Now, the real question then becomes, this is healthy participants where you're inducing pain. Well, what actually happens when you have chronic pain patients who are using this in the long term? And that's where we actually don't have any controlled data on. We only have some kind of prospective observational studies. And they're contradictory. So here is a study that was done in Israel, where they took 176 participants. This was an open label study. And they found that at 6 months, they had nearly a 50% reduction in opioid usage. They also reported improved pain severity. Now contrast that with another paper recently published out of Australia. They followed 1,500 individuals who had chronic non-cancer pain, who were being prescribed opioids. And they followed them over many years, and they found that those who self-reported using cannabis for pain actually had greater pain severity and no impact, no reduction in opioid usage. Now, there's a huge caveat here that I want to talk about. So in Israel, medical cannabis is very well regulated, and it's legal and it's ingrained into the culture. So a physician will prescribe medical cannabis. You'll go and get the product from a dispenser or from a pharmacy. And the people supplying the products are nationally licensed, professional, pseudo-pharmaceutical companies that are producing the cannabis to CGMP standards. So in Israel, it's very well regimented. So these 176 participants, they were getting it under the care of a doctor. They were getting standardized products, used in a regulated fashion. In this Australia study, at that period in time, they didn't really have a medical cannabis program. So these are people who are essentially buying from the black market. The products are not standardized. Are you consistently getting the same products each time? Not really under the supervision of a physician. So maybe the difference is the product varieties, how they're used, right? Okay, now let's talk about medical cannabis laws and opioid overdoses and what we see there. So this was a study published a few years ago, and what they found was that compared to control states, states that legalized medical cannabis saw resultant drops in opioid overdoses, and it was sustained over time. So in year 1, you had a roughly 20% drop in opioid overdoses compared to control states, and it looked like over time the effect actually strengthened. And on average, you had about a 25% reduction in the amount of opioid overdose deaths in states that simply had medical cannabis laws in their legislature. Okay. Now, there was a follow-up study. Oh, and actually another, I don't have the slides here, but they also then looked at Medicare Part D prescription drug spending, and they found that states with medical cannabis laws also had lower amounts of opioid prescriptions as well, based on Medicare data. Now, another study that was published earlier this year tried to ascertain what is it about the medical cannabis laws that's actually driving this effect. And what they found is that it's not so much that the law is there that's important. What is more important is how easy it is to open a dispensary, right? So it's really an issue of access. And they found that, two states that both had medical cannabis laws, one had very restrictive dispensaries, one had very loose dispensaries, more access, more number of dispensaries that were easier to open. You found that it was really the more liberal allowance of dispensaries that was driving the protective effect. And in fact, they actually found that the protective effects have dissipated over time. So when they're looking at the window all the way from the late 90s all the way to now, they're finding that the protective effects are actually less valuable now. It could be because the opioid epidemic is shifting, right? People aren't really going from prescription opioids to illicit. Some are starting directly with illicit opioids. That could be a possibility. Another explanation is that medical cannabis states that are coming online now are actually starting with a very regulated program. So like California legalized medical cannabis in 1996. This was not a regulated program whatsoever. Whereas states that are legalizing cannabis now are they've learned from the lessons of all these prior states. They've learned from California and Washington and Colorado. And so when they start their medical cannabis program, it is very, very regimented and regulated. And maybe that's why you're not seeing as much of a protective effect. Here's another contradictory study that was recently published that actually found that medical cannabis users were more likely to use both prescription drugs and or were likely to use prescription drugs medically, but also use prescription drugs non-medically. And so a potential observation or comment to this is that, okay, maybe folks that use medical cannabis are more likely in general to both use prescription drugs and non-prescription drugs, but that the effects of the cannabis use are still protective. So even though they're using, they might be using opioids both medically and non-medically, they're maybe using less than if they weren't using cannabis. Okay, what about withdrawal symptoms? So there's actually very robust preclinical evidence that both THC and CBD can mitigate withdrawal symptoms in animals during opioid withdrawal. And there's been a few studies where they administer THC as an adjunct. They administer it with drugs like naltrexone, and they find that you also have improved symptoms during the withdrawal detoxification period. You have improved appetite, improved insomnia symptoms, improved energy levels, et cetera. So, and if you look at, again, this is not here, but if you look at survey data, there's also observational survey data where participants report that when they use cannabis during withdrawal, it helped symptoms. So this is kind of corroborated from animal studies all the way to kind of real world clinical studies and then kind of real world observational studies. Let's talk about, and lastly with my last minute here, I'll talk about cravings. So again, preclinically, we find that CBD is actually able to attenuate opioid-seeking behavior in animals. And actually, there's been one clinical study done thus far where they found that administering CBD to individuals who are recently abstinent from opioids was actually able to decrease the amount of cravings when they showed them photos of heroin. It was actually reduced the amount of cravings. And the interesting thing is, the effects lasted for up to a week after the last dose of CBD. And so we're still trying to decipher the mechanism for this, but there's this sustained effect after you administer that last dosage. And actually, we just got a grant at UCLA to do a follow-on study where we co-administer CBD with buprenorphine and see if that can increase or if that can decrease the odds of relapse in people who are in treatment for opioid use disorder. So that's really exciting. So we're basically doing a follow-up on this study to expand the size and play around with different dosages to see what's the optimal dose. So today, again, at the end of the day, it's a mixed bag, but what's interesting today is that we have some data sets that are really exciting, some first of its kind data sets that we can apply to opioid usage. So dispensary locations over time. We can see how a dispensary might affect the impact on opioid overdoses in a geographic region. We also have total THC sales per capita that we can play around with in different county levels and see how that correlates. So again, these data sets have never really been applied to opioid data sets. So, great. All righty. Thank you very much.